thank you for joining us. This is our inaugural webinar jointly between NACD and the CAQ on audit committee effectiveness. I'm Vanessa Teitelbaum. I am a senior director with the Center for Audit Quality, and I am really pleased and appreciate being joined by a great panel today. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. So we'll start with Lauren Cunningham.
Yeah, thanks, Vanessa. So Lauren Cunningham, I'm the Keith Stanga Professor of Accounting and the Director of Research at the Neal Corporate Governance Center at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville's Haslam College of Business. And my research focuses on audit, corporate governance, and the SEC filing review process.
Very appropriate for today. And next, David Herzog.
Hi, I'm David Herzog. I'm the audit chair for MetLife, and I was formerly the audit chair for DXC Technology, and now the lead independent director for DXC Technology. I was the CFO for AIG from 2008 through 2016, upon which time I retired. So happy to be with you today. Thank you.
And I'll also say that we appreciate David doing public service on our audit committee council at the CAQ, which is why he's here today, partially why he's here today. And last but not least, James Andrus.
Hi, I'm James Andrus. I'm the Interim Managing Investment Director of Sustainable Investing at CalPERS. I also sit on the SEC IAC, the PCAOB IAG, IFRS Advisory Committee, the CFTC MRAC, and as of yesterday, I am the immediate past FASAC member.
So that's a lot of acronyms. There'll be a test later. Just kidding. Thank you, James. Appreciate you joining us. We really are excited to talk from different perspectives: audit committee, academic, and investor. Before we get started, we're going to do a short poll to understand who is in our audience, and we'll tailor our messaging accordingly. So let's launch that poll now. Here we go. So tell us your current occupation: external, internal auditor, audit committee member, management, investor, media, other. And we'll share those polling results in a minute. Okay, so whenever the polling results, okay, good. So we have 46%. I say good only because that was our intent, is to focus this on audit committee members. Of course, you're all welcome, and we think these comments will be useful for everyone in our audience. So we're here to talk about broadly audit committee effectiveness and specifically audit committee disclosures in the proxy. The genesis of this is two recent reports that the CAQ published. Both were partners. We partnered. One, which Lauren will talk about in a moment, we call it the kitchen sink report, which I love because I don't know, I just think it's catchy. It's called Audit Committee, the Kitchen Sink of the Board. And Lauren's going to talk about her research team and the work that they did. And then we also recently published what we call our Audit Committee Transparency Barometer. This was our 9th annual. We partner with Audit Analytics on that report. And we'll get into that as well. So Lauren, I'm going to kick it over to you to describe the kitchen sink report. And both of these are on the CAQ website, and they are available for free.
Yeah, thanks, Vanessa. So first, I want to make sure I give credit to my co-authors. So that's Sarah Stein, Kim Walker, and Carnisha Wolf. They're all at Virginia Tech. So the goal of our project was to better understand why crowding of responsibilities happens for some companies and not others within the audit committee. And so we interviewed audit committee chairs or members from a wide range of company sizes, industries, maturity levels. And we asked them to talk about how their responsibilities have been evolving so that we could identify the reasons why some audit committee members are taking on wider and wider scope of responsibilities, maybe related to cybersecurity or enterprise risk management, most recently ESG disclosures, but other audit committees are not. We also wanted to understand how they decide what level of detail to disclose in their proxy disclosures. So we asked them to talk about their experiences with proxy disclosures from the perspective of the audit committee. And we supplemented those viewpoints by talking with preparers. So for example, corporate counsel, or corporate secretary, general counsels, or CFO. One thing that we learned pretty quickly was that those two groups of participants were not hearing from investors on what investors were actually using or wanting to see. So we also interviewed professionals from the investment community, and our key goal there was to learn whether or not the current disclosures about audit committees in the proxy statement or audit committee charters, does that allow investors to really distinguish audit committee quality from one company to the next? And I know we're going to get into some of those disclosure related findings later. So perhaps I can just kick us off by highlighting a couple of particularly interesting things about how audit committees are managing that workload. So first, I'll highlight that we heard that audit committee members want to be purposeful about developing skill sets that match those oversight responsibilities. And so this means actively thinking about the committee's key risks when they're planning for continuing education opportunities or when they need to utilize specialists. It also means regularly evaluating whether the audit committee needs to be refreshed. Maybe they need to bring on very specific skill sets that aren't currently there. And it also means managing the audit committee's agenda. We heard several audit committee members talk about the need to dive deep on some of these evolving risks. And so that means mapping out those risks throughout the year to make sure that they do have time to kind of dive deep at least once on everything. Another set of highlights that I'll talk about now are some leading practices on how audit committees free up their time to manage that evolving set of responsibilities. We heard a lot of things about fine-tuning the types of materials that management's giving the audit committee, making sure that as many things as possible are in that pre-read packet. And then that means also holding audit committee members accountable for having gone through that pre-read packet. And then that frees up the meeting time to be really focused on analysis and, talking more critically about maybe how management's handling those risks. We also heard some great leading practices where audit committee chairs asked their members to timely reflect on whether the meeting allowed for sufficient time to discuss that topic. And then they could quickly adjust by adding more time to the meeting or scheduling additional meetings. That also means being flexible as an audit committee, because these are the types of topics that they might not know going in how long it's going to take to discuss. And so they talked about regularly the importance of maintaining that collaborative relationship with management, because ultimately they are relying on the information that management's providing to them. And then finally, our report shares some interesting leading practices related to collaborating with other board committees whenever the oversight is shared.
Thank you. And we'll follow up on some of that a little bit more. And I honestly think this is just a great report. Granted, I'm a little biased, but I really thought it was a good read. Some things maybe not, I'll be honest, like not super surprising, but always good reminders. And then I did really like the cross section though of feedback from investors and general counsel. So David, let's go to you. We like to have real life perspective, not that academics isn't real life, but you have a different perspective. And so how did you find these findings square up with your experience, and how do you find at MetLife and your other board experience think about allocation of risk?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I found the work thought-provoking, and there's as we've chatted about, there's no sort of one size fits all, and I think depending upon how boards are structured committee-wise. So at MetLife we have 5 standing committees, and if you think about it, it's a global insurance financial services company. And so the committee structure is really thoughtfully designed and fit for purpose. So the committee structure addresses the risks that the company faces, that the board oversees. But the crowding, if you will, I think it's a really helpful reminder to companies. So even though we have 5 committees, it's easier in that structure to target where the risks are best overseen. So for example, we have a finance and risk committee that has primary responsibility for oversight of enterprise risk management. although we get regular reports from the head of ERM in the audit committee, it's the primary responsibility of that committee's of finance and risk. And the other thing that I think is so helpful for us at MetLife is that we have overlapping membership of these committees, so that there's, if you will, think about it as a mosaic of committee responsibilities against the risk, so that the governance has primary responsibility for the oversight of ESG. Now, long before the draft rules even came out, the head of governance and corporate responsibility and I began to map out how the two of us would oversee not just the day-to-day activities of what the company was doing, but then how it manifests itself in the SEC disclosures eventually. So we're planning ahead for that. And again, it's easier to do because we have overlapping committee memberships and very clear lines of what committees are overseeing. But again, we tend not to be at MetLife, tend to be the dumping ground. I've been on on other committees where it tends to be, but in those cases we had fewer committees, and so there were fewer choices for where to put things. And all it does is just then expand the amount of time and effort it takes from the committee. Again, you have the risk of crowding out, but I think my experience is that directors are going to take the time that is required and not give short attention to those things that are on the agenda.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask you a little bit of a call an audible here. You and I talked a little bit before about some best practices that MetLife does when it comes to pre-reads.
Yes.
And I don't know if you could talk about that a little bit, because Lauren was alluding to that from her.
Yeah,
report.
and it's a great point that Lauren made about the quality of the pre-reads. And it's not just, again, every company's different. People are going to do different things. Management's going to do different things. Boards are going to take data in different ways. But at MetLife, the pre-reads are written documents. They're not, we don't get just the slide. We do get the slides just ahead of time, but it's about the written materials, that they're written reports that walk through with exhibits. And most of the exhibits then ultimately, the relevant ones, find their way into the quote, the presentation decks that management does. But those pre-reads are what I would call stand on their own, and you can read them and have a very good understanding of what the issues are, what the topic is, and management basically tells the directors, this is what we're going to ask you to action we're going to ask you to take, and so it's, again, we find them very helpful, and again, over time, management's done an even better and better job of taking the time to quote, write us a shorter report. So, because you think about it, there are hundreds of pages of material that are being presented, and it's, as a director, you have to read it. Because there's always lots of information there. So if they send it, you read it. And so they've done a very good job of taking the time to write more concise pre-reads, and then the slides build off of that.
Right, because you were telling me that you're not spending the meeting time with report outs. You're really spending the meeting time on discussing.
Right. And that, I think Lauren made reference to that as well, because it is important to have the dialogue, right? Because I've got one of the ways we manage the calendar of the audit committee is to actually have a calendar. And so we meet 11 times a year scheduled. We make liberal use of off-cycle meetings to go dive deeper into various topics, educational, director education topics. For example, we have a new accounting literature coming out for insurance companies, and it was complex, and it's big, and it has very broad implications. So we had several meetings leading up to that to take directors through that new requirement, through the new guidance. And but we have a calendar. It's got 48 some odd items on the calendar, mayonnaised over the 11 scheduled meetings. And so we leave time for things that could come up during the year, but we try not to get surprised. So that calendar is very thoughtfully put together ahead of time, so we can manage it so that in the event that something comes up, we've got time. But it's not, we're not short of things to do.
Yeah.
But we do try to manage to that calendar.
So James, I work with David and others, and I always hear, and I'm familiar with my experience as an auditor prior to coming to CAQ, like I see the good work of the audit committees. I've lived it, I've breathed it, not as an audit committee member, but I know from them, and we featured MetLife in our barometer in the past. So my sense is that audit committees, probably not universally, you can't always make these generalizations, but are very engaged, especially, and so I'm coming to you about audit committee disclosures. You're not in the room. You want to know that they're doing this work. The kitchen sink report talks about some steps you can take, audit committees can take to enhance disclosures. The barometer talks about the S&P 1500 and surveys what disclosures are made. It gives a lot of examples. What's your perspective on the state of audit committee disclosures? And by the way, sorry, we're going to come to some of the Q&A in a minute, but James, go to you.
Thank you very much for the question. I really appreciate the barometer report. And I have to say it's somewhat different from what my experience happens to be, because we tend to focus on the opposite end. I think it is in fact the case that we applaud most audit committees, but there are audit committees that are in fact on the tail and do need improvement. And those are the ones that we focus on. My interest in audit committees began in 2015 while working at CalPERS, and there was an opportunity to provide comments on a concept released on audit committees provided by the SEC. Through that, I did substantial research, and I was immediately troubled by what I saw. Unlike some of the things in the barometer report, one audit committee said the Audit and Finance Committee does not itself prepare financial statements or perform audits, and its members are not auditors or certifiers of companies' financial statements. An audit committee actually telling investors what they do not do instead of what investors want to hear. It's like, what are you doing? A simple level up from that, some audit committees said, well, all you have to do is basically tell investors you have a charter, reference AS 16, and then the investor has to understand Sarbanes-Oxley. Again, no information. This is fully inadequate. And the issue is that investors have become substantially more sophisticated with people who are actually looking at these items. I think it is important that the barometer on page 13 says, increased transparency improves investor confidence. That hits the nail right on the head. When we read things from an audit committee, and sometimes they're incredibly simple, you have greater confidence that the audit committee basically won, because we view the people on the audit committee as professional, competent, and good, and that if they're taking responsibility for an item, we have greater confidence that it's taken care of. The concern becomes when they do not take that important responsibility, and we engage when there are problems at the company, and we start to kind of unpeel that onion and look at what's the source. And often that is when the audit committee just isn't communicating. I think it's important that in the appendix, you show of the barometer, you show some good reporting, and in some cases it's simple. For example, for Haverty Furniture, audit committee tasked with reviewing our ESG disclosures. Investors appreciate things that are that simple. We know the audit committee is looking at this, and so basically there's instantly more confidence. in the concept release, I suggested that the US should go more to the UK approach, where they then had the Rolls-Royce report, which basically the chair of the audit committee informed the investors on what the audit committee did during that particular period. That's exactly where the kitchen sink report comes in. In many cases, we're unaware of the other things the audit committee happens to be doing, and so they don't get any credit for it. And then we would actually have more confidence in the company because the audit committee has taken these things on. So I really applaud that report and applaud the fact that they're bringing audit committees back into the forefront, because they have a critical and important function for investors.
Thanks. You know, in our experience over the years of working on and talking to audit committee members, and especially the Barometer, and we have this on our website, we called it Professional Focus. There was a woman that Jan Babiak, that we interviewed, and a couple of years ago, she said to us that she found the Barometer insulting, because she was like, why are you telling me to disclose my job? I'm doing, like, why do I, of course I'm doing my job. Why would you think I'm not doing my job? This is required, these certain things are required by SOX. And if you're familiar with SOX. But you're saying what she learned from outreach was that not all investors have more confidence when it is written down and it is more explicit. And we also cite in our Barometer a few academic studies that found a correlation between enhanced disclosure, audit committee disclosure, and audit quality, that it was a signal of enhanced oversight, and that contributes to audit quality. We do have a couple of questions, which just in terms of compensation of committees, David, you might know this better than me, but I'm pretty sure that in general, for-profit board services compensated, and that's disclosed in proxy statements.
Yes.
Yeah. And then before we get into some of the other questions, I'm going to go back to you, David, in terms of the MetLife. I mentioned we have featured MetLife in our Barometer before, some best practice disclosures. How do you, when you are looking at disclosures for the proxy, has it evolved over the years? Do you, what are some of the challenges to updating them, the disclosures?
Yeah, it's obviously, I think disclosures have evolved over the year. We, again, at MetLife, it's a very thoughtful process where the corporate secretary's office is heavily involved in it, and in that team, and they're a very capable group of professionals. And we have good discussion around, you know, how much is enough, because there's always a tension, I think, of being too granular of information, and so again, we're trying to take the time to write a more concise report that gives investors information that they want and need, not just quote, check the box to say what is minimally required, because like many committees, we're doing a lot of work. We take audit quality very serious, and so the key is to how to try to convey what are the topics that we're looking out after, what are we overseeing, and how are we you know, it's not enough to just say what we're doing, but say a bit of how we're doing it, in terms of the work we do around internal controls. Again, we're not auditors, but we're trying to exercise our responsibilities to make sure that those executives that are charged with executing controls in a control environment, that what are we doing to actually satisfy ourselves that we have satisfied our responsibilities, and made sure that yes, we're comfortable they're doing what they said they would do before we put our name on that report.
Yeah. Lauren, let me come to you again. The kitchen sink report, the audit committee, the kitchen sink of the board report did talk about audit committee disclosures, certain steps that audit committees can take. And this is a little bit different than we discussed in prep, so sorry. But, you know, I find that in our discussions, we often hear there's some pushback from general counsel. There's some hesitancy to what can be disclosed. And maybe you can talk a little bit too about some of your findings in that regard.
Yeah, so I will say, maybe it's because the type of people who wanted to talk to us love disclosures. You know, I mean, let me just caveat that really quick, but the general counsels that we talked to were completely reasonable. You know, one went so far as to say, oh, the board rules. Like if the board wants that in the proxy statement, that's going to happen. And so in our report, and in the academic version of the paper that we've written separately, we love to say it just takes one. Like it either takes a corporate secretary or general counsel that's, you know, believes in the importance of transparency, or it can be the chair of the audit committee who is sending them things like the CAQ Barometer, or I know a lot of the large accounting firms have great resources on this. And, you know, audit committee chairs and members, they don't have time to go read 25 to 50 proxies every year, but these reports like what you're doing at the CAQ, that's really easy for them to forward over to the general counsel and say, can we just have a conversation about this? This is what peers are doing, and why don't we look like peers? And so one thing that we saw in general is that in this, James alluded to this already, is that there's really kind of two groups of disclosures out there. There are those that are still clinging to those bare minimum SEC rules. And then there's kind of this herd of disclosures that are, I hate to say the word mimic because it sounds like it's not thoughtful at all, but they're kind of just wanting to make sure that they stay in this pack of these ones that are doing the things that are, you know, similar to your recommendations. But I think something that we heard consistently from investors is they really want to see it go a step further to tell that story of this unique audit committee. And what James was saying earlier, you know, these disclosures are so important because it gives investors the chance to distinguish one audit committee from another. And so being willing to tell your story on what is your oversight style, what types of expertise you have, how does that expertise link to the risks that you're overseeing? Let me pause there, Vanessa, and you can tell me kind of where you want me to pivot from here.
No, that's great. I mean, one of the things that we have heard over the years is that if you don't, and James, I'd be curious in your view on this. We hear from some investors that there is a skepticism about the audit committee being independent, and that there is a concern that some audit committees might be rubber stamping and you know, management decision, and there's not pushback, there's not oversight, and therefore, when you think about the going back 20 years, the potential, you know, some perceive there to be a conflict of interest between the external auditor being paid by those who they audit, and the audit committee is intentionally an independent body to provide another layer of oversight. And so, to me, that is a big reason why, if you look at our barometer, we say, do you disclose? And we actually had two new questions in the 2022 edition about looking at whether not just are you involved, for example, in the selection of the engagement partner, which isn't every year, but how are you involved? Like, what does that involve? And when we looked at those differences, the percentage of S&P 1500 companies who disclosed, are they involved? That's much higher than describing how they're involved. So again, that is, James, let me ask you to respond to that.
So I think from my perspective, it goes even further than that. I mean, so basically we haven't talked about non-audit fees as well, which basically was this source in Enron, WorldCom and the like, and it's still an issue and a concern. And so I think from a disclosure perspective, it would be helpful if audit committees share their assessment of the independence and objectivity of the external auditor, the assessment of the appropriateness of fees charged, the assessment of non-audit services and fees, and why you used the auditor instead of another source. Focus on auditor rotation and how you analyze that. and assessment of issues, which resulted in an auditor resignation. I think it's also critical in terms of from where I sit and what I'm looking at from a PCAOB perspective. I note that a number of, too large a number of inspections fail. And it's just a question of like, is the audit committee made aware that one, you were in fact inspected, two, the auditor failed that inspection, and then does it do anything about it? And it's still like in a box in terms of finding out. But it's troubling to see when you look at the rate, the failure rate, and note that, wow, what are these companies doing about it?
Yeah, I think
do they even know? So basically, when we talk about, you know, one, what is the audit committee doing? And the important fact that I think is changing is that we want the audit committee to make clear that they're in fact working for the share owners.
Right.
And that and that some of the ways you do that happen to be disclosure and to show that you are in fact independent. And like Lauren says, interestingly enough, especially at the audit committee, sometimes it just takes one to hold the company's feet to the fire to do the right thing.
Yeah, I think inspections is an interesting point. We have a guide to PCAOB inspections on our website, and we have some questions specifically for the audit committee. One of them is just to ask, because for those, in case you don't know, I think it's a statutory restriction. The PCAOB does not disclose the issuer that is being inspected, right? So, but the audit committee can ask, was this company inspected? And you can consider if, now, relatively speaking, James, my personal view is that the inspections is a relatively small number of engagements inspected, you know, in the grand scheme of things, and it's high risk. That's not to dismiss at all your point of view, but you know, whether or not it's hard to know, and the PCAOB will say that their inspection results are not indicative of all the firm's broad, you know, audit practice. David?
Yeah, just to add to that point, I've been associated with a number of companies whose audits have been examined by the PCAOB, and as part of that, and credit to the PCAOB for doing this, they are reaching out to audit committee chairs as part of their examination process, and so they interview me on a number of different accounts or engagements along the way. So I think it is. So yes, we were very much aware that the okay. Specific company was being, the audit was being examined. They're not examining the company; they're examining the auditors.
And only certain parts of the audit sometimes.
Yeah, yes, they were. I'll call them targeted reviews. One was more broad than the other, but they were very engaging. And I think, again, my experience with talking with other audit committee chairs in the various networks that I'm associated with is that the audit chairs almost without exception will have dialogue with the lead engagement partner about the examination results, not specifically about their company, because you're right, there you know, relatively few exams done year in and year out, but they all ask about the findings, whether they're public findings or the non-public findings, do they affect the audit of our company, or, and more important, do they shed any light on any of the procedures or controls or accounting that are being done at our company specifically? And so again, my experience has been that's part of the regimen that good audit committees will do, is that they'll dig deeper into the findings to see how they're relevant to their own company.
Thanks. It's good to hear. I'm going to go off script a little based on our Q&A in the time that we have left. David, this is a question for you about the MetLife. How interested is the MetLife Audit Committee in culture of the organization in general and the internal audit function in particular?
Very interested in both, as you can imagine. Again, a large multinational company who's got a terrific brand and reputation, and so culture matters a lot. And we get at the audit committee, we hear what I'll call finance tone at the top. You see and hear that frequently, and you get that at all the various touch points. But culture for a company like MetLife has been, they take it very, very seriously, and they do periodic, regular surveys. They call them My Voice surveys there, but they try to dig deep on the culture, the transparency, speaking up. If you see something, say something. And I always look for what I'll call examples of that, good examples of good examples. And so whether it's hotlines, whistleblower, that type of thing, where people deep in the organization feel empowered and protected to raise their hand. And so you look for examples of that. So good. And then internal audits, that again, they play a critical role. We're what I would call a traditional 3-line model. We have a strong first line in how that's defined, and then an enterprise risk management is the second line, and then internal audit is the third line. And there are all three lines of defense operate independent, but also they coexist very well and feed off of each other. So we're very interested, obviously as an audit committee, and the head of internal audit reports to the committee, ministerially to elsewhere in the organization to the CEO, but from an independence and the like, that the chief audit executive reports into the committee. And we do executive sessions with that executive nearly every meeting, so that it gives, in this case happens to be him, gives him a ready outlet to convey things. And obviously, like most of my colleagues at major audit committees, we do lots of pre-meeting calls, and there's a lot of opportunity for dialogue should there be a reason to escalate something to me offline.
Thank you. One more question we have, which I'm going to go to Lauren on, is about continuing on with internal audit, is a question about what disclosures are there being made over the oversight of internal audit. And I'll preface this by saying, admittedly, the Barometer is not looking at that because the CAQ is focused on oversight of the external auditor specifically. But Lauren, do you have a view on disclosures related to internal audit?
Yeah, I'd love to know if James or David have seen different trends. That what comes to mind for me, but I've done a little bit of research with the Institute of Internal Auditors. So it's something I just kind of kept my eye out for while we were working on prepping for these interviews. And there was not a lot out there. We don't hear a lot, even as simple as what David was saying, where the chief audit executive has, that would be called an administrative reporting line directly to, the audit committee, or maybe a CEO or CFO, kind of even the structures about, who is the CAE and who do they report to functionally versus administratively? Or I love the question you posed, the size, scope, what is the nature of internal audit, and what are some of those maybe key risks that they're focused on this year? I do think the internal audit is something that boards rely on pretty heavily to have a pulse on what management's telling them and what else is happening. Culture, David, I know that's been a big thing for the IIA in recent years. This is, I think, another great example of something that we saw is that I applaud the companies who shifted around the time that you started the CAQ Barometer to start telling us more about external auditors. But I think we're at the stage where it's okay, now we need to know about these other things that you're also overseeing. Let's take that same momentum and let's apply it to the full scope of what the audit committee does.
Right.
And I'm a proponent of enhanced internal auditing. It's not necessary outside of the financials. And so basically as an investor, it's really unclear what type of function most companies have internally and how they do what investors think is happening anyway. And I think that overall internal audit needs to be improved.
The disclosure of it or the execution of it?
The execution, I mean, the disclosure of it is non-existent.
Okay.
So basically the execution of it needs to be improved. And I say that because basically companies outside of financials are not required to have that function. And from an investor perspective, we think it adds substantial value in reducing risks.
David, you're nodding. I don't know if you want to comment from.
No, I totally agree that it's the three lines of defense. Again, I came up through the financial services and insurance space. It's vital. I mean, our internal audit function at MetLife and the other companies I'm associated with, it provides invaluable checks and balances. And again, the functional reporting to the audit committee, and then I'll call it ministerial reporting up elsewhere. Sometimes it's through general counsel, sometimes it's never to the CFO. That's not appropriate, but it's somewhere else in the organization ministerially.
Right.
So I think I agree with James. It's vital. I mean, as a director, I can't imagine being on a company like this without a strong internal audit function.
Yeah. And I will say too, from other discussions I've had with other audit committee chairs, when they talk about the effectiveness of internal audit, one audit committee chair told me that her approach is to really support the internal audit, make sure the board, the tone, her as an audit committee chair, it's that audit, internal audit executive feels that she has that person's back.
Vanessa,
Yeah.
if I can jump in really quick.
Yeah.
So I think something that I'm hearing about this conversation does remind me about the importance of these disclosures in general, because David, I've done survey work with the IIA of CAEs, and it is a very large percent of U.S. public company chief audit executives that administratively report to the CFO. And I'm in your camp where I don't think that's appropriate. That's not a truly independent internal audit group at that point. And David, it's actually a really small percentage where they administratively report to the CEO. There's also a tiny amount that they say they administratively report to the board or the audit committee. But that's an example of where disclosure, what gets measured, gets managed, and so maybe more disclosures around here give us a chance to really see what's happening broadly and where there are opportunities to improve governance. Because
I agree. You've given me a good idea to go back to the company with. I think it's great. I mean, to me, it's sort of just basic checks and balances. And so it's in segregation of duties. I mean, this is 101 control environment type things. And so I'm glad to hear we're at least where I think we've got, at least again for our company, it's the right answer, ministerially to the CEO and functionally to the committee. But I don't know. I'll have to go back and look. I don't know that we disclosed that. So.
Yeah, and Lauren is giving me an idea. We'll work offline separately to think about how we can perhaps publish some of these best practices on the internal audit side for audit committees. So we're coming up on time. I know you probably have this our audience may have this on their calendar for an hour, but we wanted to keep it a little bit shorter in the academic spirit of things. So let's wrap up this webinar with the last question. I'll go to each of you. We've been talking about different practices as Lauren's research summarized in the kitchen sink report, and David, in your experience, and James, your perspective, and also audit committee disclosures as we publish in the Barometer. But the last question is, just in terms of the evolution, of risk and scope for the audit committee. maybe a key takeaway for our audience from an audit committee disclosure. What is your view on what our audience can take away as a best practice for thinking about enhancing their audit committee disclosures? James, I'm going to start with you.
Okay, I think consistent with what the kitchen sink report states is that let us know what you do, and that will be a dramatic enhancement. Separately from my own take, to the extent that we do not get that developing, investors rely upon the character and the respectability of the audit committee. It is important that as a group, members who get to serve on audit committees make certain that those standards are maintained and are high. Interestingly enough, to the extent that you can, even influence the audit committee of other companies to make sure their standards remain high as well. And I think that's where we can get some added protection.
Thank you. Lauren, can I go to you next?
Yeah, Vanessa, something that we haven't talked about yet is just the kind of why do investors use these disclosures and how there could be some diverging uses that kind of cause some tension here. So on the one hand, you have the types of investors who want to do that high touch, engagement. And so more personalized, tell your story type disclosures help them figure out where they should be focusing during their engagement time. And so I think that it lends more to qualitative, this why, how, those types of questions. But then you also have proxy advisors or, index funds that are voting on hundreds, if not thousands of companies at once. And so I think as we move forward, I'd encourage companies to think about what I'd call both the quantified side of their disclosure as well as the qualitative side of their disclosure, maybe even just starting with who are our investors, and let's make sure that our disclosures meet the needs of the different types of investors our specific company has.
That's great. Thanks. David, I'm going to give you the last word.
Thanks. Well, I personally lean heavily on our corporate secretary, who does spend quite a bit of time listening to our investors and try to take that feedback into the drafting of the report. Because I agree. I think unless we tell our investors what it is we're doing, and a bit of how, because again, there's a healthy tension between enough information and too much information, just because it's not going to add value. We don't need a longer report. We just need one that's continually tries to focus on what are the issues that investors care about. So give me some food for thought on internal audit. And how to make better reference to them. So thanks.
That was a insight from our listeners. So I want to thank everyone for joining us. David, I'm probably not quoting I think it was Mark Twain, but might not be the right person. If I had more time, I'd write a shorter letter, is my favorite sayings, because it's true. Effective disclosure is not longer, and so I know it's hard, but I think we at the CAQ and our work, and I just think James and others have reinforced, does anybody care? Is anybody looking at these disclosures? And the answer is yes. So we hope these resources and this discussion was useful. And again, I want to thank Lauren, James, and David so much for joining me today. And with that, we're going to close out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much.